Hello and welcome to Doc Talks.
I'm Kimmy.
I'm Evee.
And I'm Liam. And in today's episode, we will be taking a look at a picture taken at Little Rock, Arkansas. In the picture, there's 9 black students being escorted into the high school.
To understand what's going on in the picture, we have to look at what's going on in the civil rights movement at that time.
6 years before the picture was taken, in 1951, there were protests in Virginia schools because of segregation. These school protests started the civil rights movement as we know it. 3 years later, in 1954, a court case about school segregation called Brown versus the Board of Education made segregation in schools illegal. This court case led to the integration of schools in the South.
One of these schools was Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, to integrate black students in the school. 9 students were chosen to go to Central High School in 1957. Even though segregation was just made illegal, the local governor, Orville Barbas, thought that the integration would cause locals to be outraged, so he used the National Guard to prevent these 9 students from entering.
The president at the time was Dwight D. Eisenhower. Despite being a traditionally Democratic president and neither in support of segregation nor against it, he decided to enforce the court's decision. In order to enforce the law, Eisenhower sent in the 101st Airborne Division to escort the 9 students into the school. I think that Dwight Eisenhower's decision to send in the 101st Airborne Division is going to be pretty similar to a court case we saw a few days ago. It was kind of about gerrymandering, stuff like that. There were 7 districts in Alabama, and only 1 out of the 7 districts had a majority black, and they thought that it was a violation of the 14th Amendment, so they decided to send out a Supreme Court decision that they would have to redistrict everything. The governor is still against it and maintains that he's going to keep the districts, and that's why I think we're going to kind of see a similar thing to Dwight Eisenhower, or at least I would hope that the president will enforce it versus just letting the governor just do what he wants.
I mean, either way, it's gonna get... What do they call it? Revoked or something?
Revoked.
Revoked?
Yeah, that word, yeah.
What's going to get revoked, do you think?
Your gerrymandering thing, right?
Oh, that's going to get denied by the state legislator?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure. I think so.
Legislator.
Unless it already passed.
Well, so it already passed in the Supreme Court. The question is, the Supreme Court has no power over it, right?
No, that's just...
It's just the executive branch. So if the state decides, oh, we're not going to do this, even though they technically have to, unless the president himself, sends in something, the head of the military, all of that, unless they decide that they're going to enforce it, it's not going to happen. So I think it kind of comes down to the military and government involvement.
Do we think that the military is going to get involved in a 21st century civil rights case, though? I mean, I feel like that would cause such a big uproar amongst the population that they might not consider it as an option.
Well, before in these past years, when there's protests about gay rights and stuff, the military has intervened, especially the National Guard, where they just...
Yeah, and
for public officers.
I mean, yeah,
obviously to intervene and not to So I mean, yeah, I guess it might happen.
Mm-hmm.
I would guess just politically that the governor of Alabama and just the state government will end up deciding to enforce it anyway, just for PR reasons. And
but
such.
when we talk about Little Rock 9 and the military's involvement in it, it was a lot easier to kind of pull those kinds of stunts, especially in the middle of the 20th century, because people didn't have that much access to what's going on where, and whatever. So I feel to do something as drastic as they did with Little Rock 9 nowadays would create such a backlash.
It would be hard.
Sense.
It would, yeah, and also this is kind of a weird case because it's so governmental, redistricting.
Mm-hmm.
It's not actually people doing stuff. But I mean, there was a lot of in the BLM protests. There were a lot of police officers involved, a lot of military involved.
Necessarily not military, but police officers.
Yeah.
And yes,
militarization of the police was involved very heavily, and that was what made it super dangerous. Is that militarizing the police? They don't have that training to handle those weapons and handle those situations that people have been training for years. So, like, I feel like that was one big thing when we talked about BLM and the police involvement in BLM, is that they had access to military weapons that they did not know how to operate properly. And that's what made it so
it's like not
dangerous.
even military weapons. It's just putting themselves in situations that they shouldn't put themselves in, and creating situations that could have been prevented. So, like the George Floyd case where the police officers just killed him, I'm pretty sure, and like I can guarantee that could have been prevented. In other cases, a lot of things could have been prevented, but because there are many people who were against civil rights and many people who are still racist to this day, it's going to happen.
Yeah, I just think when it comes to like BLM, like that was a case of state government, right?
Yeah.
Police officers, where like government involvement would have been more likely to help.
But and then it started to reach like the president, and then it started to
Executive
reach
branch,
like it started to reach a lot of stuff, but like nothing was really done about it.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I guess that's right. I mean, there was a lot of police involvement. I guess not necessarily government and military involvement, but I feel like there was some case where it was where government involvement was used in BLM as well. I think those are very different than the case that I originally brought up, the Alabama case of redistricting.
Do you feel that the civil rights, the way that the military and state police is handled, so the civil rights cases and the civil rights marches in the 60s is comparable to how they handled the BLM movement nowadays?
No.
Well, I think it's comparable. I don't think that it's like the same. I mean, nonviolent versus violent. Also, it comes down to the protests, right? There were civil rights protests in like the 60s and stuff like that were nonviolent marches versus like there were obviously violent protests as well, but pretty marginal amounts. A lot of the protests like in the BLM movements and in the modern civil rights cases were very violent.
Yeah.
And that's a case where it's hard to judge whether the government should get involved, the military should get involved, because would it help to have like, because there were a lot of people against the civil rights movements, right? We saw the shootings on the street by like even just kids, but would have military helped lessen the deaths? It's hard to know. And when we look back at the picture of the Little Rock Nine, right? There are people who are angry outside watching the 9 students get integrated. But if there had not been actual military there, if the government didn't get involved,
there would have been much more violence.
And it never would have happened. We would have never had integration. So
and then I think there would still be segregation in schools till this day.
I don't think there would be segregation in schools, but in that one case, like I don't think that school would have been integrated, for sure. And then
if they weren't to be integrated, I don't think anyone would be.
It was only Arkansas, so I think that it would have just taken so much longer, and that's why I think it's important to have the government intervene in a case like that, to make sure that it goes smoothly and that we do get the actual integration, or we do get whatever the actual judicial branch says. But if he had not gotten involved, if he was like Andrew Jackson, he would have just been like, well, what army do you have? Like, I'm just gonna let them stay segregated, and it would have been that way for a long time. As well as the fact that it just wouldn't have happened. The integration would have never happened, and there would have been larger riots. Just in that case, I think the military needed to be involved.
So how has segregation in schools changed over the past couple of years?
Well, there's still
actually, I kind of want to bring that question a little further. In small communities, how has segregation been?
Yeah, on the micro scale versus the macro scale.
Yeah,
I think it's still an element. Like we still see it in some places. Even in our community, we saw some zoning between Hispanic and Caucasian students, and that caused a lot of outrage, and it still exists, but at least it's not legal. Like it's not as prevalent as it was back then, and I think that's because of like the president's involvement, not on smaller community basis, but setting that precedent for the local governments.
So like in schools, kids have already grown up to treat each other as equal people. It doesn't matter the ethnic group and stuff. But
It depends.
outside of school, well,
It depends on the community. I mean,
well, yeah, if they were raised in like a really
traditionalistic,
traditional white community, then they're gonna be taught to disrespect other ethnic groups. But a majority of like places teach their kids to respect other ethnic groups. So, but other than kids, outside of that, the older people who are stuck to the traditional ways and the old ways are still racist to these groups. So
yeah, and they're the ones that often have say in local government, and they, even if they're not like as outwardly against integration, or not necessarily integration, but they just want more separate schools, they can kind of try and create that in a loophole way, and then you need like intervention. You need somebody to come in and be like, you can't do that, right? So there was a private school in Kings Beach that was practically like white only school, and they created another school further on the West Shore just for Hispanics. Like, it still exists. Obviously that ended like a few years ago, but it's still a problem, and it needs executive branches on the smaller scale, like in local governments, to enforce it. Yeah, I thought that Eisenhower set like a very good, not legal precedent. That was the judicial case that set legal precedent, but a good precedent for future presidents to actually be involved in movements like that, protect the citizens and stuff like that. Before, we saw like Andrew Jackson, he did not get involved at all. Even when the judicial branch ruled something, he would just only go with his own opinions.
Going back to presidents setting a precedent for future presidents. President John F. Kennedy was the first U.S. president to set in affirmative action to ensure that applicants are treated equally without regard to race, color, religious, sex, or national origin. And affirmative action is basically like reverse discrimination in a way, where we put into place policies and quotas to ensure that groups are represented in certain areas of our government and certain areas of our education.
And that actually kind of ties back perfectly to like Brown v. the Board of Education as well, where we have the integration and
exactly
stuff like that.
And that's what I have to say about that.
Yeah, I don't know. How do you feel about like affirmative action and like the quotas that people set? Because it kind of disadvantages other
disadvantages other groups, and then I feel as if the quotas should match how our population looks like. So going back to that court case that you brought up, how 25% of the state was black, yet they didn't have it. They only had one district that they were a majority in. I feel as if, going back, there was a case regarding in Michigan regarding public facilities and whether affirmative action should be taken, and that was in 2003, and the Supreme Court decided that it was constitutionally right to use race quotas and affirmative action in public universities and colleges. And I feel as if, like, if we were in a state like Michigan, like, say, X is the proportion of black people in the state, that's how many should be. That's what their quota should be in their universities, if that makes sense. I don't
know how I feel about quotas. I feel like, especially in universities, I'm not sure if it should necessarily be racially based at all. It should just be based on like the level of work given. Like, if one. Yeah. I mean, it depends. If you could be like race blind, I feel like whatever amount of participants would get in, then I feel like would.
But then I feel like if you have equal education within your state, then you're going to already going to kind of balance out that the quotas in that way, meaning 75% of your state is white, and then 75% of your university is also white, but of that group of people that is the word? You know what I'm saying.
I think that's a case where it's rough to know whether government imposition is like a good thing to set in, because like universities already will do that because of PR, right? They'll try and get equal amounts of like equal opportunity.
But then I also think about how, going back to that gerrymandering
case. Yeah.
How they will I had read about this, about how they will gerrymander and then give those districts or give those areas less funding for education, like the ones with more people of color. And so I feel like race quotas should be important, because if those groups of people aren't, given the same amount of education as, their white counterparts, then they should still have a chance to get into a university where they can kind of catch up, or where they can redeem, where they've been harmed.
Yeah, so kind of creating that, just like Arkansas 9. It's similarly like just making sure that they have equal education.
Yeah.
Stuff like that. All right, I think that's a case where you can debate whether government should get involved. But overall, I think President Eisenhower's decision to send in the 101st Airborne Division was a good choice, and the use of government intervention in this case ended up moving forward the social movement and decreased the conflict.
I also definitely think that the governor of the state bringing in the National Guard at first was a big mistake, because it definitely did create tension. But with President Eisenhower bringing in the 101st Airborne Division, it kind of just maybe decreased the tension, but there was still violence and there was still riots and protests going on.
Yeah, and it was just good to have that kind of involvement.
Yeah.
And that concludes our Doc Talk on the events of the Little Rock Nine.
Once again, I'm Kimmy.
I'm Evee.
And I'm Liam.
Thank you for listening to this episode on Little Rock 9 and the Civil Rights Movement.
Make sure to listen to our next episode.
And make sure to subscribe and share our podcast with your friends and family.
Thank you.